Hello and welcome to another episode of Game, Develop, Repeat, the podcast where we talk about a game that I enjoy, what makes it special, and what we as game developers can learn from it. I'm your host Chris, a music educator turned indie game developer, and today's episode is all about Final Fantasy IX. In this episode, we discuss fatal flaws, planning, character personalities, and Final Fantasy IX's item skill system. Let's get to it. Final Fantasy IX is a game which surprises me to this day. I am surprised at how much I like this game because when I was a kid, I didn't expect to like it. And then I played it, I ended up beating it. I beat it a second time without realizing that I'd already beaten it once before. And I also have another playthrough where I went quite far in the game. I really enjoy the skill system, the item system, the music is phenomenal. There are a couple fatal flaws that we're going to talk about. I usually don't cover the negative sides of a game's design because I find it more valuable to focus on the things that are positive for the sake of my own education. I think it's harder to notice the stuff that's being done right, and I think it's more valuable to notice it. So that's one of the reasons why I do that. But we are going to point out a few fatal flaws just because I think they're things that are valuable to look at for my own development and easy to forget about. That's why we're going to talk about those flaws. The music is phenomenal. The skill system is interesting. The character design and the art style is very interesting. It is not 100% my usual thing. I usually go in on something that's just like a little bit darker or a little bit more like realistic. And this is very fantasy. Everybody's kind of got some kind of fantasy trope going on. They're like literally just animals walking around in the city. Like there are just like hippos that are like NPCs and stuff, right? So it's a little weird. It's very cutesy. And then it's got, well, let's dig into the specifics of a few of these things first. I am once again going to avoid spoilers, with the exception of talking about overarching themes. So you won't get any specific spoilers, but you will get like, this is a trend that keeps popping up within the game. Having said that, we're going to talk about one of those trends right now. There's a trend in the plot, which I'm going to call the futility of planning. There's this thing in the plot where like there's always some plan that goes completely wrong or takes a huge left turn or just completely changes. It stands out to me how much from the very beginning of this game, they have a very clear laid out plan and then everything goes completely wrong and they have to make it up as they go along and improvise and then it works out better anyway. It's a very human game. There's a lot of moments in this game where you're like, oh, this is how the game is going to play it out. And then nope, not at all. Everything's completely different than you expected. We're going a different angle on this. And I think that's common in JRPGs, and I just haven't really thought about it before, but for some reason it stands out to me in Final Fantasy IX, probably because of the whole opening quest, the whole kidnapping everything, and that is the very beginning of the game, like literally right at the beginning this pops in. This is how obsessed I am with not spoiling things. It's like, this game is old, but I know that there are people out there who have not played it because it's a massive JRPG. So like, I don't want to spoil the whole thing for somebody who hasn't experienced it, even though it's been a very long time since it was released. I think over 20 years. But that is a cool overarching theme that I can get behind, this feeling of, here's this super clear plan. It's going to work so well. It's going to be so crisp and clean. And then, oh, one of the people we're interacting with has motivations that we didn't expect. Or we don't have this information. We thought it was this and it wasn't. And it's about making assumptions, and it's about having those assumptions corrected and then having to kind of just stand on your own 2 feet and go, oh, okay, what do I do now that I've realized that my assumptions were completely wrong? And I appreciate that as a deeper level message, right? And I also appreciate how it affects the gameplay. It makes the game a little bit, I say gameplay, how it affects the story, how the story plays out. It makes it a little bit less predictable. It makes it a little bit more enjoyable. It's nice to not have everything following the tracks perfectly. And this is like a necessity of story writing, I guess, is to mix it up, is to not have everything go exactly the way that you say it's going to go to begin with, but to still follow through on the promise. That's the other element of this that they really pull off. Um, every promise that the story makes does pay off in a way that makes some sense. And this is one of the things that I think I appreciate about Final Fantasy IX. It makes more sense to me than most Final Fantasy games. Most Final Fantasy games have this breaking point where everything goes insane. It's like the game makes sense, the game makes sense. Now we're traveling through time and there's an interdimensional wizard. And what? Like they have this point where everything goes completely nuts. And like Final Fantasy IX gets a little weird, sure. But as weird as it gets, it it leaves a memory in my brain of like, oh yeah, that made sense. Could I recap the plot for you? No, it's been years. But it does generally feel like it makes sense to me. If I think back on Final Fantasy VIII, I'm like, I don't know, man. I don't know if that makes sense. Final Fantasy X is baffling, but at the same time it almost makes more sense because I've grappled with it so much to like understand it, and I had somebody else explain it to me and all this stuff. Like I've talked about it so much with other people that it ended up eventually making sense to me. Let's talk about some of the fatal flaws of this game because I can't stop. They're just floating around in the back of my head and I have to address them. There's two. There's two that get to me a little bit, and we're going to be pretty brief about this. One, the loading time to enter a battle. And I think I may have even mentioned this in a previous episode. The loading time to enter a battle in Final Fantasy IX is unacceptable. It's so long, dude. I swear to God, like 10 hours of a playtime, and like, oh man, I don't even know how much time it takes up across the span of a whole playthrough of this game, but the time it takes to enter a battle is just way too long. It's wild. And I'm sorry if you've not noticed this and are now having a glass shattering moment about it, or if you go back and play it and then it frustrates you too much. But like it should not be that long. I don't know if it was a technical limitation or what, but I do know that there are games that have this problem of like you die and then it takes forever to get back into the action. A lot of really good games specifically designed around stuff like that, or at least it seems that way to me. A game like Super Hexagon is addictive because it's so quick to get back in. There's a lot of like roguelikes where it's like you die, you jump right back in. You die, you jump right back in. You're good. You don't have to go through this whole slow thing. In contrast, there are games that have this problem where you have to go through this really long process all the time that you're repeating frequently. This is one of the things that keeps me from playing Don't Starve, even though I like it a lot. I think it's a good game. I don't want to replay the beginning of that game every time I start a new run because it's got this really long beginning that's usually kind of the same, at least for the way that I play it. Now, the battle screen, the loading screen for random encounters in Final Fantasy IX has that effect, except it's like every 20 seconds. And you're just like, oh, we're loading again, and we're loading again. Somehow I forget about it. I think I forget about it because the music is so good. I don't know. It's odd. I'm not great at talking about music, even though I'm a musician, because my experience of it is I really enjoy that. It gives me this vibe, or I really don't enjoy that and I don't know why. Like, I don't go into like, oh, this chord progression is doing this cool thing. And like, I don't really go in on music analysis that much. But what I will say is that the feelings that this music gives me are appropriate for the scenes that it is played over. So the world exploration theme is so cozy and simultaneously like kind of exciting and playful. They tie in this one theme across the whole game really well. There's like one little musical motif that is brought into so many different songs. It's the like the princess's theme, I think. I don't know the name of the actual track, but it's so good how they tie it into everything. Garnet's theme, I guess, is probably the name of the track itself, if I had to guess. But there's a little motif in there that's just embedded through the entire game, and you don't really realize it. But that kind of like embedding of one idea and then using it for different purposes makes everything feel just a little familiar in a way that lets you have a stronger like emotional reaction to it at the right moments. So very impressed by that. I missed a fatal flaw, so we're going to jump back to that real quick. The other flaw is actually also a good thing, and I hesitate now to call it a flaw, but we're going to talk about both these things at once. The skill system, the system for learning skills, is tied to your items. So it's tied to the items that you have equipped, which is really cool. You use the item for a while and you learn the skill. Very interesting, big fan. I like it. You're kind of like imbuing yourself with a power from like the essence of the item or whatever. I don't know exactly what the like lore explanation for it is, but I definitely like it. There is a problem with this system, however, which is that you will sometimes be stuck wearing this like bad equipment, or, and this is my actual problem with it, because that's just like a timing scaling kind of a thing, whatever. My actual problem with it is there are certain items that you cannot get unless you hold on to old, really bad weapons that you don't really have a reason to hold on to. And you don't realize this until fairly late in the game. So there's this crafting system where you can make new weapons by combining old ones. And there are some weapons that you can only make by using these really old, beaten up, like crappy little swords that you would have just like gotten rid of or whatever. So it creates this situation where if you are not hoarding every weapon, and in some cases even buying extras of weapons that you don't need before you've even learned that the crafting system exists, if you don't do that, then you're not going to get some really powerful stuff later in the game, which just feels like, I don't know, that feels like a mechanic that is only useful if you're replaying the game. It's kind of weird. I'm not sure how prevalent the issue of not being able to get another of the weapon is. I think there's at least one or two cases where like if you sell something, you're in trouble later. Like you're not going to be able to make some really cool thing. But at the same time, I don't know. Like even if everything's not missable, there's still this feeling of like I'm being punished for getting rid of these things that I don't need, and that's not cool. Because now I have to run around and find a place to buy it and blah 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 blah. That's a little frustrating. But I guess my answer to that flaw would be make all old weapons available at every shop or something like that, right? It might make some menu bloat, but I don't know. Or just introduce the synthesis, the item crafting system much earlier, right? That might take care of it too. The last thing I want to talk about is the character personalities. So there's a lot of strong personalities in this game. There's a lot of like very exaggerated personality traits. There's a lot of like this character's essence is this one personality trait or kind of emotion or what have you, right? Oh wait, there's one other thing I want to throw in on this actually, now that I think about it. But the personality traits are really important in this game because they manage to make these guys kind of caricatures, but because they play it for comedy and do this like the game almost has like a comedy of errors thing throughout it, which fits in with the whole futility of planning element, which is like everything kind of goes wrong, but these characters are kind of expected to mess things up because they're so focused on this one thing, and they all have this like fatal heroic flaw of like they're too locked in on this one thing. Which I appreciate. I don't know exactly how they pull off this balance of making sure that these characters are appealing while also being so exaggerated. I do think it has a lot to do with a little bit of a comedy bend they do on it. Like, you're not taking them too seriously, so you're not getting frustrated by them as much. Although at times I do get frustrated with some of the characters, but they do feel very human despite being very exaggerated. Okay, really quickly, one thing I just remembered is a concept that I always discuss with my brother, which is the idea of there's this thing where you have a character in your party who gets locked out of your party for a while. You don't use them. And then in the time that you don't use them, all of your other characters progress so far, or you get so used to using their abilities, or you put so much better gear on them or whatever, that when you get the character back in your party, you no longer use them like at all for the rest of the game because they're so far behind and you don't want to train them up and whatever. My brother and I call that Steinering because there's a character in this game called Steiner who seems like he has cool abilities. He's got this cool, like, collaborative ability with another character. He's got some cool stuff going on. But there's a chunk of the game where you don't get to use him as much. And he falls behind. And because he falls behind, there's this moment for me where I'm like, well, I guess I'm just not using him anymore. And honestly, they give you a way to catch him up and all this stuff, right? But it is a thing in JRPGs where for story reasons, they get rid of a character, and when they come back, their power level is completely different from the rest of your party. And I haven't noticed it as much lately, but it does feel like it always feels like the developers just made a guess at what level you're going to be when the character returns to you. They're just like, oh, they'll probably be about here, maybe, I don't know, whatever, just give them that level. Or they just go, oh, just don't level them at all. I'm just like, why not make it feel just a little better, right? And maybe this is more of a problem with like older games rather than newer stuff. But man, it drove me off the wall. It's in a bunch of other games to the point where my brother and I nicknamed it Steinering. I don't want to ever Steiner a character. I don't ever want to have a character that disappears from the party and then becomes this character that I completely ignore. So there needs to be a compelling reason to start using the character again, because maybe it's just a mental thing, and they need to not fall behind in power. I think that's pretty important. Okay, let's move forward and talk about how we can apply the stuff we've learned from this game to our own game development projects. Questions about this game. I've got 3 written down. The first one is about the character personalities, and then we've got something about story and theming, and then a quick one about a game mechanic. So let's start with the character personalities. It is, are exaggerated character personalities applicable to a smaller scale game? I'm going to go with yes, and I think part of that is because what exaggerated means is entirely up to you. I think part of how Final Fantasy IX pulls it off is because they're exaggerated over a very long span, and they're not doing this like really, really hard-hitting, heavy-hitting thing. If we look at a game like Undertale, talk about exaggerated character personalities, but they're hitting you quick, and they're hitting you with just ridiculous, goofy moments, and they're hitting you hard, but it's always funny, and you don't interact with them to the point where it, you know what, maybe it's just charming writing, but the characters never get really annoying. Now, that is a little bit larger scale. Let's look again at something else. I'm trying to think of something very like small scale, but I you know what, I'm just going to use a visual style to explain this. If we look at Spelunky, I think that there are clear, distinct characters in that game. Like, just from the visuals, they have a clear personality. There's a lot of like assumptions that we make just from looking at the characters and from very brief dialogue and brief interactions with them. Almost any game that we look at, I think you can see a personality tucked away behind every character, and I think it is valuable to sort of create a caricature that is not obnoxious, though. Oh, Phantom Dust just popped into my head. I can't even start talking about that. I've got to do an entire episode on Phantom Dust at some point. That game is so good, but it has some wild characters too. That's not my main focus on that game, but it does have some wild characters, and it's much more gritty. That is a gnarly game. So yeah, I think for a smaller scale, absolutely. You can do a lot of stuff visually. You don't have to have a game that has a ton of story to have very exaggerated, goofy, fun to interact with characters. I do think there's a thing of make sure that a character doesn't get on your nerves too much. Like, don't commit so hard to the bit and having the character be obnoxious that they're just obnoxious, right? If it's so well executed that the audience is not in on the joke and is just annoyed, right? Or is just like, man, this character's like, if it goes so far, then you're running a pretty big risk there. And I do think I've run into that a couple times where like the writing style is a little over the top in a game, and it's like, okay, buddy, chill out a little bit. Like I'm just trying to play the game. I can't think of examples right off the top of my head, but I think we've all run into that. So I think that is the balance. But I do think that these over exaggerations are handy. I think it's kind of similar to in music, we always say to over exaggerate everything when you're performing because it's like stage makeup. It's like theatrical stage makeup. Like what you hear as the musician is so much more dramatic than what the audience hears because you're right there. You're right by the instrument. The guy in the back of the auditorium doesn't hear the same contrast that you're hearing because you're right there. When you're making something, you're going to see it very differently from other people. All right. So it might be, this is interesting. I think it depends on your particular personality. I think for some people, you're going to have to exaggerate the character's personality traits. And then I think for some people, you're maybe going to have to like tone it down or like do some check-ins with other people and see how it's coming across. Like have those people who are very honest with you about your writing and be like, hey, this is like, maybe even do anonymous feedback, right? But like really find a way to get people to give you very authentic impressions of like how the characters are affecting them. And then keep in mind who's giving you that feedback and so on and so on and so on. And now we're just talking about playtesting. So let's move on. Next question. Is it necessary to set an overarching theme to my game's story? So we kind of talked about how this story to me has this overarching theme of like planning having a lot of futility. Like plans go wrong all the time. And that's a common one in a lot of games. Is it necessary to set something like that in advance? And I say that, but you could make an argument for the theme of this game being a million different things. That just happens to be what I've locked in on today. I'm not saying that that's what the entire game is about all the way through, and it's not about anything else. Like the game clearly has the things about like friendship and love and all of this stuff. Like it's got all sorts of themes, but the question itself is it necessary to set that theme to begin with? I think if you are working solo, it's very different from if you're working in a big group. I think if you're working with a whole bunch of people, it's really important to get everybody on the same page as soon as you can, or to have a process through which you reach an agreement. So maybe there's some exploration that everybody does, and then you have a meeting and whatever. I think for an individual, you can have a little bit more chaos, which I really appreciate. As somebody who's still figuring out what I'm doing, embracing chaos is a little bit of a necessity sometimes. I think that setting a theme right at the beginning, if you don't know what the game is yet, is a little bit dangerous and less necessary. My thought process is, kind of like I was talking about, like, you can make plans, and that's good, and you should have plans. You should have a general direction you want things to go in. But I think you got to be willing to be flexible on those plans. So as an individual, if I set a theme for the game, I need to be willing to flex and move if the game wants to be something else. I've run into this with what I'm developing, where I wanted it to have this very specific play style where you're always climbing up. And then I discovered that the mechanics need to be explored descending too. Like they need to be used for things other than just upward motion. And so I was like, okay, cool. We're just changing that. Like I had this plan and that's not how it's going to play out. And why would I be wedded to that? It's just an idea I had at some point. And I just went, oh, that's a cool idea. And then you play it out and you learn more about the idea and you go, oh, you know what? All right, let's mess with this idea a little bit. Maybe reduce the intensity on that theme a little. Um, Next question, and this is one I'm very invested in. This item skill system in Final Fantasy IX. What would make it more enjoyable? What would make learning skills from items more enjoyable? In this instance, I think it's already pretty enjoyable, but I do think that the friction points for me are completionism and feeling like once I've gotten far enough along on an item, I have to finish it. That's an issue. So there's like a completionist kind of pacing thing going on there. Um, and then moments when I don't have an item to learn a skill from, and I kind of get like frustrated about not being able to keep working on a skill. That's the thing. How would we do this? How would we manage this? I think Path of Exile manages this by using skill gems that you put into your items so you can change items more frequently. That's really cool. It's kind of a blend of Final Fantasy IX and Final Fantasy VII in that way. Like it's kind of drawing on the materia system for sure. The materia system is a big solution to this. I think the other element of it is that it feels a little mandatory. I don't know. I like this idea of like you permanently learn this thing from using it, but at the same time, I kind of want it to be a system that you engage with a little bit more loosely, or, and you may have picked up on this already, have it be a skill based system. I'm a big fan of these skill based systems where like you have a real challenge so that it's not just a grind. So maybe it's a grind, but if you do something with the right timing, then it's a lot less of a grind. Big fan of that. Big fan of skill-based systems. Always interested in ways that we can include skill-based systems in our games, especially in things like a JRPG where it is traditionally a bit easier for sure, a bit less challenging. Um, yeah, that's my thought. I think for me personally, my angle, and this will be different for everybody, but my angle would be creating some kind of a skill check that gives you accelerated progress. And there's going to be other problems that pop up as a result of that. Oh man, thinking about this, I'm like, maybe I should not design a JRPG anytime soon. I want to make a JRPG one day, but like, the more I think about all the individual systems involved in it, I'm like, this is going to take me a while to develop all these skills. There's a lot going on behind the scenes in a JRPG that I just did not think about until I started doing this podcast, which is great. And that's one of the valuable things I get out of this is noticing the things that I didn't notice before so that I can kind of break through that Dunning-Kruger syndrome, which I think everybody has a little bit, where you're like, oh yeah, no, I know how that works. That's only because I don't know enough about it. So this is how I'm learning more about it, by like just playing with the ideas a little bit. All right, let's talk about what I did in my game this week. Quick spoiler, didn't do that much. Crazy busy week. I had stuff that I had to do every afternoon, like all week, because it was the 4th of July week, and my friend has a birthday, and then I had like some get-togethers and all this stuff. It was all good stuff. It was all enjoyable stuff. But basically, those are my excuses for not working on the game much. I could have gotten more done. I fully recognize that one of the reasons why I didn't get much done is because I have been stuck in on music land, and I need to step away from music a little bit. I'm getting stuck, and it's time to pivot. Like, I went in, I investigated the wall, I improved my process a little bit, and kind of felt out where that barrier is that's blocking me from making a bunch of music. I figured out where it is, and now I need to step away, explore other stuff, and come back to it, because I'm losing a lot of time right now by just getting locked in on it, and I'm losing my groove, so I need to get my groove back. So I'm going to do that by moving back to doing some level design, which should be nice and intense. I did do a tiny bit of animation. I got a animation done for the little flame enemies in the game. Oh my god, the game looks so much better now than the demo. The demo is so dark and like it's rough, dude. And there's so many levels in the demo that just like have no point really. So that's changed a lot. That is still changing. You can, you can look forward to significant changes from the demo, thank goodness. The art I'm much happier with. Yeah, anyway, so I overestimated what I was going to get done this week, and as a result, ended up a little bit disappointed in myself. But I recognize what is causing me to not get as much done, and hopefully, the changes that I'm going to do this coming week will resolve some of that issue. Let's move on to the final section of the podcast. Here are 3 questions inspired by Final Fantasy IX that we can ask ourselves about our own project. First, what tiny, frequently repeated elements of my game might need modified? Kind of like the loading screen in Final Fantasy IX. That's exactly where that's coming from. What unexpected systems does my game have, and how can I test their impact on player experience? So what new thing is there? What do we need to look at that might be having unexpected consequences? What are the new untested systems? What's not a standard trope in the gaming industry? That's kind of coming from the item skill learning system, which has some unexpected consequences. And then lastly, are any characters in my game under or overutilized? Is there somebody who is spending too much time on screen? Is there somebody who's not getting enough time on screen? Who do I really want to be in there and fully utilized? And maybe somebody's being overutilized and they'll be a better character if they have just a little less screen time. And then this week's tip is really, it's for myself. These tips are always for myself, but I'm just sharing them with you in case they help you out. This week's tip is to search out new influences, methods, and different perspectives whenever you get stuck, especially. I mean, anytime you want to do it, but especially when you get stuck. And then I added a little note here, which is to escape your plan, which for me means let go of the thing that is keeping you locked in this little room. Let go of this plan. Sometimes the plan turns into a cage and you're trying to make the plan happen when you don't have the tools for it, and you need to pivot and change the plan a little bit and mess with it and kind of improvise a little bit. Get a little wacky with it. It's fine. You can mess around with it a little bit. So I'm going to have to do that because I've been too locked in on the music, and I need to escape that plan a little bit and go back to some other stuff and come back around to the music when I have let it digest a little bit. I got all my rough drafts. That's all I needed. Now I just gotta let it digest. So for you, maybe there's some other angle where that advice is useful. Maybe not. Maybe it's just interesting to hear my process a little bit and the stuff that I'm working on. That is everything that I have for you this week. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for joining me. And I will talk to you next week. Have a good one, make some stuff, and have fun with it. I'll see you later.